In this Ventra Pro video, we're going to be setting up a cool pad, mister, fogger, soaker, any of those devices for cooling will be included in this device settings. They're all available whether it's poultry or hog application. And in this particular case, I have a cool pad high set up. Now the cool pad high and cool pad low are just two different options that you will see. And some people like to use two different pumps, one considered one pump for low, maybe two pumps for high, or something similar to that. So there's no difference between cool pad high or cool pad low. And then also the way you set your mister, your fogger, or if you call it a soaker, all these settings will be the same. So on our current environment conditions, we'll go to our hotkey, which in this case is number 17 for our cool pad. And here you can see you start your cool pad high group settings. Now we're in zone 1 here, and our first choice is use sensors, and in this case it says all. Now this you just choose whether you want to set up individual sensors or whether you want to just continue to use all the sensors to activate your cooling device. Then you arrow down, and here you now have a time of day where you can enable its use and disable its use. And in this case, we have it set to enable at 8 a.m. and disable at 2200 hours or 10 p.m. Remember, this will be on a 24-hour clock, so make note of that as you set your settings. Arrow down again. And here we have a humidity disable. We do have a humidity sensor wired into this controller, so you do have this option. If you don't have a humidity sensor, you will not see this. So for humidity, just for an example, we're going to disable it if we see a humidity of 90%, and then we're going to re-enable it when it gets down to 88%. Now again, some may want to set that around 85 and maybe 84 or 83 for a re-enable, but again, this is an example. And that's where you would set that for your humidity disable and re-enable. Arrow down. We now have an option for temp plus humidity for disable and re-enable. This is a feature that's in our Ventra line where you can use effective temperature. And by seeing that, you go to control settings and arrow down where it says temp control. You have actual and you have effective. Effective takes into account, based off of a scale of temperature plus humidity. Actual is just looking only at the temperature. As you can see, the star is over next to the actual, so I am only looking at the actual in this case. If the star was over by effective, then the controller, for the certain areas that it uses it in, will use the temperature plus the humidity to activate or deactivate certain options. Now again, as we go back to the cool pad high, now in this case, since we're not using the temperature plus the humidity, if you leave it at 220 on the settings, that will disable this function and it's not going to look at it to use that at all. And if you want more information about that, there is a section in our manual for the Ventra Pro that discusses the temperature plus humidity index. Arrow down again, we now have our full on temp and the off temp. Again, in this case, we are set for 87 on and 84.5 off. Now that is the entire cooling system shutting off. And let me reiterate on that and show you here. As we get down, we have cycle temps that we may use if we choose to. And in this case, our first cycle temp is 85 degrees. Note our off temp at 84.5 degrees. Your off temp must be below your first cycle on temp if you want to use your cycles. Now, if you're not interested in using your cycles, then your off temp may be closer to your on temp if you prefer to only run, say, 2 degrees from your full on to your off temp, or 1.5 degrees. But in this case, we want to set our cycle temps. So our first cycle temp comes on at 85. Then we use the plus or minus keys to scroll through, since we have 4 cycles that we can use. So our second cycle temp is set at 85.5. third cycle 86, and fourth cycle at 86.5. So those are our 4 settings for our cycle temps. Now our cycle timers are below that again. We have our timer on and our timer off. We have hours, minutes, and seconds. And for this first cycle, since it's just a short burst of cooling, we just have an example of 30 seconds on, 5 minutes off. And again, using the plus and minus key, cycle 2 have set for 1 minute on, 3 minutes off. Cycle 3, 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off. Cycle 4, 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off. And again, those are just examples of how it could be set. You know, you would have to determine how you would like that in your own setting, how long it takes for your pads, your foggers to cool the barns down so you don't overly cool too quickly. But those are just some examples. As we scroll down again, we have another important setting, which is the minimum on temp. Wherever this is set at, that is the minimum temperature that the barn must get before it will allow the cooling to come on. So if you accidentally set that too high, then even if your full on temp is set at, say, 80, your minimum on temp is 82, it's not going to let the cooling come on because your minimum on temp is set too high compared to where you would like it to be. So make sure that your minimum on temp is below your cycle temps and your full on temp so that it will be able to run. And now if you arrow down one more time, this just is an overview look of your minimum temps. So we have our first cycle on temp, second cycle on temp, third cycle on temp, fourth cycle on temp, and there is our full on setting. Now remember, our full off is 84.5, which is below our first cycle temp. So our cycles will work as the barn begins to warm up. And here we're now back to using all our sensors. So there's how you set your cooling system, whether it's a cool pad high, cool pad low, mister, fogger, whatever you would like to call that. All the coolings will be set exactly the same.